Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Minnesota Leadership Forum, brought to you by Minnesota Family Council. Please welcome John Helmberger, CEO of Minnesota Family Council and Institute.
Good evening. Thank you. Welcome, and thank you for joining us at this debate tonight. We are so glad that you're here participating with us. Those of you who are with us live here at Providence Academy, those who are listening on radio on AM 1280 The Patriot, and those who are watching online via live stream from Alpha News. It is so encouraging to see so many people taking this important race this seriously, so we're very glad you're here. I'm also thankful for our co-sponsors for this event tonight, AM 1280 The Patriot, Alpha News, and the Freedom Club. Their partnership has helped to make this event possible this evening, and we very much appreciate them being with us. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, Minnesota Family Council and Minnesota Family Institute, our educational arm, and True North Legal, our legal arm, together form the largest evangelical Christian grassroots organization in this state, fighting for the sanctity of human life, for God's good design for marriage, and for religious freedom, promoting citizenship worthy of the gospel of Christ. You can find out more about us if you'd like at our table in the lobby afterwards or online at mfc.org. I have a couple of announcements now. We invited all 5 of the conservative candidates for Attorney General to participate in this debate tonight. Initially, 4 of those candidates accepted our invitation. One candidate, Dennis Smith, declined. Then 2 days ago, another candidate, or one of the 4 candidates who had accepted, Lynn Torgerson, withdrew from the debate and asked that we not include her name on the straw ballot. And so we've honored her request. And speaking of straw ballots, you should have gotten one when you checked in the lobby. If you did not, please raise your hand now. We've got volunteers in the aisles who will get a straw ballot to you. We're asking you to fill those ballots out during the first half of the debate. We'll collect them from you at the 5-minute break that we'll take at 7:30. We'll count the ballots during the second half of the debate and share the results with you all at the end of the debate before we close at 8:30. And now I would like to, I'd ask you to join me in an invocation asking God's blessing on this proceeding tonight. Let's pray. Almighty God, we honor you and acknowledge that you alone can rightly guide our country. We ask that you bless our country with your wisdom, your love, and your compassion. May we be a people who pursue you and your purposes for us, individually and corporately. We pray for our leaders and all who are in authority, that you would grant them wisdom to know what is right and courage to do it. Thank you for the candidates we'll hear from this evening and for their willingness to present themselves for the ministry of elected office. Grant us discerning minds as we listen and choose whom we will support for the important office of Attorney General, our state's chief legal officer. Let these proceedings this evening be honoring to you through Christ our Lord. Amen. Now, without further ado, I would like to bring out my co-moderator, Pafua Yang, journalist with Alpha News, to take her place at the moderator table. Please welcome Pafua. And our moderator-in-chief, Liz Collin, also journalist with Alpha News. Please welcome Liz.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for being here tonight. It should be an enlightening evening with our candidates that we're very much looking forward to. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our candidates, but before I get to that, I'll just go over the rules. They're very simple. We'll have 30 seconds for each moderator to ask a question. The candidates will have 75 seconds to answer, and we will also go ahead and rotate who answers the questions first and last, so they have a fair shot to get the first and last word in on certain topics. As for the audience, we're going to ask tonight that you keep your applause to a minimum so we can keep things moving along. Also, no booing. If you don't like a candidate, just don't vote for him. It's pretty simple. Also, no slapping anyone on stage. I guess you have to say that, too. So, a few things to keep in mind tonight. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce our candidates, and we'll go by alphabetical order. So let's begin first by welcoming retired Judge Tad Jude to the stage. Tad Jude is a former member of Minnesota's legislature and Hennepin County Commissioner, and most recently served as a judge in Minnesota's 10th District from 2011 until last year. Now let's welcome Jim Schultz, our next candidate. Mr. Schultz is an attorney from Minnetonka. Additionally, he serves on the board of the Frontline Foundation, a nonprofit supporting police and other first responders. And finally this evening, Doug Wardlow. Mr. Wardlow is a former Minnesota legislator and corporate counsel for MyPillow, and he was the 2018 Republican candidate for Attorney General. Again, welcome all. We'll go ahead and get started right away here, and we're going to start with Judge Jude. We'll begin with you, followed by Mr. Schultz. Why do you think the Attorney General's race is so important, and why are you the best candidate to defeat Keith Ellison for the office? Judge Jude.
Well, thanks for the question. I appreciate the sponsorship of the program tonight. The Attorney General's office has oftentimes been overlooked in Minnesota. In fact, I think every Attorney General that we've had in the last 50 years has run for governor. You know, they've been focused on another office. But the tone that's set by the Attorney General and the advice that's given by the Attorney General and the litigation is critical. And it's critical that we win the office this time for common sense, because it's been taken in a hyper-political direction in Minnesota. And Minnesota isn't hyper-political. As a state, I mean, we're a divided state. I mean, we have many Democrats, many Republicans, but it's been taken on this, I think, abstract run, and we need to bring it back to common sense.
So I got into this race fundamentally because we're losing the state that I grew up in. I'm a fifth-generation Minnesotan, and I'm a man who wants to raise his kids here. I've got 3 little girls, and I want them to be sixth-generation Minnesotans, and I want to raise children here that are seventh-generation Minnesotans. And we've lost that here in Minnesota over these past few years. And it starts with Keith Ellison in the Attorney General's office, an extraordinarily reckless Attorney General who backs defunding the police, who demonstrates an extraordinary hostility to police, who every day demonstrates his unfitness for office by the far-left policies he implements. And so this is the most important race on the ballot this cycle, and we absolutely need to win it. And I'm the man because I'm not a politician. I haven't been running for office for the past 20 or 50 years. I made my career in the private sector where hard work and accountability matter. That's what we need in the Attorney General's office, a fresh face, a fresh vision for the future, and that's what I'll bring to the Attorney General's office.
Mr. Schultz, Mr. Wardlow.
So the Office of the Attorney General is all about enforcing the law and standing up for our constitutional rights. And there is nothing more important. If you don't enforce the laws, they're not worth the paper they're written on. But there's an important distinction between me and everyone else on this stage. I am an experienced constitutional lawyer. For a number of years, I worked as an attorney for Alliance Defending Freedom, fighting for free speech and religious liberty in cases all across the country. I've been fighting for our constitutional rights my entire legal career. I'm also the only candidate that can win this race. I'm the only person on this stage who has defeated a Democrat incumbent in a suburban swing district. And when I ran for Attorney General in 2018, in a very difficult year for our party, we came closer than any Republican has ever come to victory, within 3.5%, closest in 52 years. We outperformed the top of the ticket by 8%. It was the first time in history that a Republican AG candidate has outperformed the entire GOP ticket. We built up substantial name recognition across the state. And you can't go on the offense against your opponent until people know who you are. My opponents, they are unknown, and they would have to spend millions just to catch up. So the political winds have now shifted in our favor. Let's continue building on the work we've done over the past 5 years and defeat Keith Ellison once and for all.
And Mr. Wardlow, you can begin this time, followed by Mr. Schultz. Crime in our major cities is a huge issue. What is the role of the Attorney General's office in law enforcement and fighting crime, and what specifically would you do to turn things around? Mr. Wardlow.
Out of control. Keith Ellison has allowed a pervasive climate of lawlessness to take hold across the state. But it's not just in our major cities. It's in the suburbs. It's spreading across greater Minnesota. Human trafficking is a terrible plague, the moral evil that afflicts every corner of our great state. It's up to the Attorney General to see that the law is enforced. So as Attorney General, I will rebuild the criminal division of the office. We are going to bring in veteran prosecutors, people with expertise in human trafficking, expertise in prosecuting gangs and violent crime. We're going to staff that up and send those guys and gals out so that the county attorneys have all the support they need to put criminals behind bars. And there are some county attorneys who aren't doing a great job. We're going to put pressure on them to give up cases to the Office of the Attorney General, prosecute them in-house, and we're going to make sure that all criminals are prosecuted aggressively. None of this low bail or no bail nonsense. We're going to move away from stays of imposition. And then we are going to change the tone. We're going to send the signal that the Office of the Attorney General supports and celebrates and honors those who wear the badge, those who risk their lives daily to deliver justice for crime victims and to keep us safe. We're going to help police departments across the state retain and recruit officers, bring those force levels back up. I will not rest until Minnesota is safe once again.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Mr. Schultz.
Politicians like to talk a lot about what they'd like to do and so forth. I made my career in the private sector where I've gotten things done. After 2020, in the disgraceful abandonment of police, the incredibly reckless hostility to police demonstrated by Keith Ellison and others, I stepped up and I joined the board of an organization called the Frontline Foundation that supports the families of first responders who are killed in the line of duty, who make the ultimate sacrifice. And so I've been walking this walk for some time. I'm not just picking it up for electoral purposes. What we need to do in the AG's office is fundamentally restructure that office. Right now, there's 150 attorneys in that office, most of whom spend their time driving Minnesota businesses into the ground, driving them out of state. We need to reallocate those resources to dealing with the incredible crime problems that are out there. And fundamentally, we've got to win. We absolutely have to win. We're all going to say we'll deal with the crime problems. But and I have to go back to something Doug said there. Doug, I like you and I respect you, but when you brag about losing to Keith Ellison by 100,000 votes in 2018, that's not something to brag about. You brag, Doug, about being battle tested in 2018. Well, Doug, you were tested, and you failed the test. You lost to a man in Keith Ellison credibly accused of domestic violence by 100,000 votes. I like you, Doug. I respect you. But we've got to win in 2022 so we can deal with the incredible crime problems that are crippling our state. So we've got to win in 2022, and that's exactly what I'll do.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Judge Jude.
Well, we'll begin by making crime illegal again. That's one of the things, many things have happened under the cover of COVID. And believe it or not, one of the things that was happening is that they've tried to depopulate the jails. If you go from county to county to county, you've had county attorneys and sheriffs and people who are in our criminal justice system trying to depopulate the jails. We need to bring it back to common sense again and have consequences for crime that make sense. Now, the Attorney General does set a tone, and that tone is set at the legislature, it's set through litigation, and it's set on the stump. And the tone that's been set by our Attorney General has just been terrible. It's not been there in support of law enforcement. He's been leading the charge to defund the police. We need to have someone Attorney General who will defend the police. That's what I'll do.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Schultz, you can respond first to this next question, followed by Judge Jude. What will you do about prosecutions in key cases where it appears a county attorney is not prosecuting crime for reasons of bias or political motivation? Mr. Schultz.
So it's a good question. You know, there's lots of people talking about in this race what they're going to do with county attorneys. And the fact is, the Attorney General in Minnesota can get cases from county attorneys in two ways. One by referral from the county attorney, one from referral by the governor. And so in those cases where a county attorney isn't getting it done, there are only a few levers the Attorney General can pull. Hopefully we'll have a Republican governor, and that would give us incredible opportunities to do a heck of a lot of good out there. Outside of that, we have to use the bully pulpit of this office to restore confidence that crime in Minnesota will be prosecuted and prosecuted aggressively. To insist that in Minnesota, this low bail and no bail stuff, the stuff where inadequate sentences are imposed upon criminals, whether they are sought inadequately by prosecutors or imposed by activist judges, we have to insist that in Minnesota, if you commit serious crime, you will spend meaningful time in jail. That's what I'll insist upon. I will leverage the bully pulpit of my office to do that. We absolutely have to do it. It's critical for the future of Minnesota to insist that everybody in this state knows when they commit serious crime, whether it be carjacking moms taking their kids to school, or murder or otherwise that have crippled our communities, we have to insist that in Minnesota, if you commit serious crime, you will spend meaningful time in prison.
Judge Jude.
County attorneys are primarily responsible for prosecuting crime in Minnesota. The Attorney General has to help small counties, certainly, in prosecuting violent crimes that are beyond the capability of the small counties. We're going to beef up that division in the Attorney General's office. But beyond that, I think we have to look at dual jurisdiction in some cases, particularly election integrity. I would have a division devoted to enforcing election laws. If county attorneys aren't enforcing election laws, the Attorney General would be doing so. And we'd work with the Secretary of State to make sure that we have election integrity in Minnesota. We'd also look at dual jurisdiction in a few other areas, and I'd work with the county attorneys to figure out which would be the most effective areas to make sure that we have an even playing field. If you're violating the law any place in Minnesota, you're prosecuted. Unfortunately, we've had national groups out there, and George Soros has been behind a few of these, trying to elect local county attorneys. And that's had a terrible impact, I believe, nationwide, even in Minnesota. And Keith Ellison is an example of how it's gone wrong.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Wardlow.
So yes, the county attorneys are the frontline prosecutors in Minnesota. But there's a lot we can do at the Office of Attorney General to make sure that they are prosecuting criminals aggressively. Now, when they refer cases to us, we will support them. And we'll make sure that we publicly make available all of the resources of the office that we're going to be building up. And so we'll put pressure on, say, John Choi and Mike Freeman by saying, hey, you know what, guys? Here are all these resources. Here are these veteran prosecutors. If you want help, it's there for you. We will make it politically unpalatable for them to say no. If they still say no, we'll identify candidates to run against them. It'll be easier to do that, right? Also, we're going to cross-designate certain members of our office as special assistant U.S. attorneys. We'll work with the U.S. Attorney's Office. If we do that, then we can bring federal cases and work with the federal government on some of the most egregious violators, people that are fomenting violence, people that are crossing into the state of Minnesota to foment unrest. And we will go after them, and we can impose the harsher penalties that are imposed by federal law. And then I'd like to look at using civil suits to go up against these county attorneys that are refusing to do their jobs for malfeasance of their duties in office or nonfeasance of their duties in office. But none of this matters if we can't win. We're going to win with me on the ticket because we just about won last time. We're building on that base. We got 1.15 million votes last time. That's more votes than any Republican has ever received in a midterm in the history of the state. So let's build on that and let's defeat Keith Ellison.
Let's go with Judge Jude first on our next question, followed by Mr. Wardlow. The prospect of Roe v. Wade being overturned this summer by the U.S. Supreme Court, potentially returning the regulation of abortion back to the states, is shining a spotlight on the 1995 Doe v. Gomez decision by the Minnesota Supreme Court, finding a right to abortion and to taxpayer funding of abortion in the Minnesota Constitution. What's your view on that ruling and what it means for abortion in Minnesota post-Roe?
This is, I think, a critical issue that'll be coming to the states, and I welcome it. The Roe decision and the Gomez decision, I think the courts had had to go through gyrations to rationalize the end results of those decisions. I have been exceptionally supportive of families, children, our future, and I believe that means that we have pro-life legislation. I would be pro-life. In fact, I was awarded the Pro-Life Legislator of the Year by MCCL because of my work in that area. I work to include unborn children in all our criminal laws, and that's the law today. You see prosecutions from time to time of an unborn child being killed. And if it isn't being killed by an abortionist, it can be prosecuted. And that is done in Minnesota. It's because of a law that I authored and was able to get into Minnesota statutes. And there are a few other areas where unborn children have rights in Minnesota. We have rights under the domestic abuse laws. We have rights in terms of unborn children, in terms of inheritance. I would vigorously work to make sure that our future generations have those rights.
Thank you, Judge Jude. Mr. Wardlow.
So we're all very hopeful that Roe versus Wade will be overturned, and things are looking good in that regard. And I hope that Doe versus Gomez will quickly follow suit. Now we're going to have a Republican governor and a Republican state House and a Republican state Senate after this election. And that means we're going to be passing some very important laws to protect the life of the unborn. And as your Attorney General, I will be there to stand up and defend those laws, just like Lynn Fitch did in Mississippi recently, in the case that will overturn Roe versus Wade, right? Defending that state's 15-week ban on abortion. And I have a strong pro-life record. When I was in the State House, I co-authored a number of bills to protect the life of the unborn, including a bill that banned abortion at the point where a fetal heartbeat is detected. So I have a strong pro-life record, and you can trust me as your Attorney General to fight in court, to stand up for those laws, and to stand up for the right to life in general. And I'm the only person on this stage that really has the experience, the deep constitutional litigation experience to do that. I have spent my whole career fighting for our Constitution in state and in federal courts. I know how to do it. So we're going to put together a strategy, and we'll move forward with that strategy to defend our laws and also to stand up for all of our constitutional rights. We'll make sure that all of our constitutional rights, whether it's life, our right to bear arms, free speech, religious liberty, we will protect them all. They will all be well defended when I am Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Mr. Schultz.
So in my life, I've walked the walk on the pro-life issue. I've sat on the board of a pro-life organization called the Human Life Alliance. I've supported the getting set up in Mankato, a crisis pregnancy center. I know, as we all know, that the child in the womb is a human person deserving of legal protection. We all know that. And so as Attorney General, I will absolutely do everything I can to ensure that the most vulnerable among us, the unborn child, are defended aggressively. And we need to not be just on defense on this issue. The fact is, Democrats are the extremists on the issue. You've got Democrats defending in Congress right now killing of 8-month-old babies. That's what we should be pointing out. And the fact is, they support partial birth abortion. They oppose parental notification. They oppose waiting periods. They are the extreme party in Minnesota. And in this election, I'll be the one going on offense on the issue. So many times, Democrats attack us, the media attacks us, and then Republicans go into this defensive crouch. The politicians go into this defensive crouch. Well, it's not going to be me. It's going to be offense, 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 pointing out that Democrats are the extremists on the abortion issue, and we're going to fight back. That's what I'll do as Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. You can go first on the next question, which is a follow-up on the previous. On the basis of Doe v. Gomez, 11 state statutes regulating abortion in Minnesota have been challenged in district court by pro-abortion groups. Included are common sense restrictions such as required disclosures about the risks and alternatives to abortion, a 24-hour waiting period, and parental notification before abortions are performed on minors. Attorney General Keith Ellison is an ardent supporter of abortion rights, but has given assurances that he would vigorously defend those statutes. What is your assessment of the defense he has mounted so far? What would you do differently?
Yeah, Keith Ellison has approached the defense of those statutes like he's approached crime in the state. He's absolutely done nothing about it. That's the fact. And so He's failed to defend the statutes, or defended them extremely anemically, because he's just simply not interested in defending these, and his base won't let him. He's an extremist on the abortion issue, and he has no interest fundamentally in defending these. As Attorney General, I will aggressively defend Minnesota statute. Think about what we're talking about here. Parental notification, if a child is considering this incredibly serious step. Pausing for 24 hours to consider this incredibly serious step. These are bipartisan laws that were put into place, and the fact is the vast majority of Minnesotans support them. And they're on the books, and right now one of the problems we have is that we have an Attorney General who is fundamentally political, and he enforces the laws that he wants to enforce, and he ignores the laws that he doesn't want to enforce. That is unacceptable. As Attorney General, I will aggressively defend state law, unlike Keith Ellison, who prefers to focus on things like defunding the police and every left-wing cause that's out there. And so that's what we'll do. We will fundamentally change the culture of that office to defend state law, enforce the law. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Wardlow, then Judge Jude.
So Keith Ellison is using the office of Attorney General and abusing it to push his private political agenda. Consider his war on the police, right? He has taken over the prosecution of multiple police officer defendants, but he hasn't taken over the prosecution of any other kind of case. He's only prosecuting cases involving police officers. So he is undermining the rule of law itself. And when it comes to our restrictions on abortion, the waiting period, parental notification, the requirement to show the mother an ultrasound before an abortion is performed, he is not putting his all into the defense of those cases. I would do things very differently. As Attorney General, I will vigorously defend all of our state laws, whether I agree with them or not, by the way. We're going to take the politics out of the office and simply stand up for the rule of law, stand up for all of our laws, stand up for the laws passed by our people's representatives, and also stand up for our constitutional rights. But I would work with a coalition of groups and bring in folks to defend those laws. Now, Keith Ellison did not welcome the intervention of certain parties that were looking to help defend those restrictions on abortions. I would have welcomed those groups in. I would have welcomed that help to defend those important restrictions, to stand up for the life of the unborn. And I have the constitutional litigation experience to do this. I've been doing it my entire legal career. And I've been litigating pro-life cases and religious freedom cases at Alliance Defending Freedom for a long time and practicing constitutional law in my role as general counsel at MIPA as well. So you can count on me to stand up for our laws and for the life of the unborn.
Wardlow, Judge Jude.
When you're in the courtroom, you'll recognize a defense, and then you'll recognize a defense. Keith Ellison will not be defending that statute, and he's even said that. He has said, I will not defend pro-life legislation, which I consider to be a complete abrogation of his authority and his duties as Attorney General. When you look at that case, first of all, it's in Ramsey County, as Judge Gillen. I've got some confidence, but we haven't seen an opinion. We haven't seen an order. But I can't see any grounds for the lawsuit. I would vigorously defend state law, and I would do that as Attorney General. That's the requirement of being an Attorney General. And certainly in that area, you need to have someone who's pro-life to defend state law, and I would vigorously do so.
For our next question, Judge Jude, you'll be first, followed by Mr. Schultz. Attorney General Keith Ellison's office personally handled the prosecution of former Brooklyn Center police officer Kim Potter in the death of Dante Wright. Would you have handled this case differently, and if so, how? Judge Jude?
I would absolutely have handled that case differently. That trial is an example of what's wrong in our Attorney General's office. You had Maxine Waters fly in here to protest in Brooklyn Center. They sent the case over to Washington County. Imran Ali was the assigned prosecutor over there. You had protesters show up at the county attorney's home in Stillwater. You even had somebody fired from the Department of Corrections because of what happened over there. And it was sent back to Hennepin County, Imran Ali just resigned because of politics and vitriol. That's not the way our criminal justice system should work. Went back to Hennepin County, went up to the Attorney General's office, they increased the charges. It wasn't based on the facts, it wasn't based on the law, it wasn't based on our Constitution. It was based on protests, it was based on what I would call mob justice. That's not right. That's not right. And that's what's wrong with our Attorney General's office. It's hyper-partisan.
Thank you, Judge Jude. Mr. Schultz.
Well, fundamentally, we need an Attorney General who will have the back of law enforcement. And I am honored, it's a great honor of my life, to be the candidate on the stage that's endorsed by law enforcement. Just last week, the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association showed their confidence in me to support the police and to actually win in 2022 by endorsing my candidacy for Attorney General. It is the honor of my life. And when I'm Attorney General, police will have stood with me through this campaign, and I will stand with them as Attorney General. The Kim Potter prosecution was an absolute disgrace. It was an absolute disgrace. As Tad points out, they upcharged Kim Potter for fundamentally political reasons. And that is representative of what happens in that office continually. What part of the reason why Keith Ellison is such a disaster as an Attorney General. He operates that office in a fundamentally political way. And what we need in that office is to insist that whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, a police officer, or someone else, that you will be treated in the exact same manner. That is not the case now. That is injustice. It's fundamentally injustice. And as Attorney General, I will support police and I will operate that office apolitically. That's what Minnesotans deserve. That's what Minnesotans expect.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Wardlow.
So the prosecution of Kim Potter is an example of how Keith Ellison has completely politicized the office. It was a complete miscarriage of justice. I'm the only candidate on this stage that, upon the verdict coming down, put out a strong statement condemning both Keith Ellison and the judge in that case, and the judge, for submitting those charges to the jury in the first instance. Because if you look at the law and you look at the facts were not really disputed. Kim Potter did not commit first or second degree manslaughter and could not have under the law, right? Because for first degree manslaughter, she would have had to be attempting to commit or committing some other crime. Well, she wasn't doing that, right? She was trying to execute a lawful arrest. For second-degree manslaughter, she would have had to take some conscious action that would risk causing great bodily harm or death to some other person. She didn't do that either because she thought she was drawing her taser, and those are uncontested facts. So under the law, as applied to those uncontested facts, those charges should never have been submitted to the jury. Those charges have never should have been brought at all. Keith Ellison took over that case for purely political reasons, to wage his war against the police. And then he added the first-degree manslaughter charge, upping the charges. That's an example of how we should not do business in the Office of the Attorney General. When I'm Attorney General, we will take the politics out of the office, we will end Keith Ellison's war on the police, and we'll make sure that all defendants are treated and prosecuted aggressively, but also afforded due process.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. For this next question, Mr. Wardlow, you can respond first, followed by Mr. Schultz. According to one report, the Minnesota Freedom Fund used donated money to put up bail for at least 19 people who later went on to commit more violent crimes or pose a continued danger to the public. The group has refused to provide a public list. What would you do as Attorney General to decrease the frequency of violent offenders being bailed out by activist groups? Mr. Wardlow?
First of all, the Minnesota Freedom Fund, the Attorney General has jurisdiction over all nonprofits in the state. And I believe that is a nonprofit in this state. So we should investigate the Minnesota Freedom Fund, make sure that they're following the law, make sure they're not violating the law, and if they are, we will go after them. We'll make sure they're prosecuted. Second of all, we're going to make sure that criminals aren't released with low bail or on no bail by putting pressure on county attorneys and changing the tone. We're going to build up that criminal division of the office, and we're going to send those attorneys out to support our county attorneys. And we're also going to put pressure on county attorneys in Minneapolis and in St. Paul, Hennepin, and Ramsey counties to give up their cases to the Office of the Attorney General, and we will prosecute them aggressively. By changing the tone, that will help prosecutors move in the right direction, and we'll be increasing the pressure on the bench as well, and pressuring them in the right direction so they don't let criminals out on low bail or no bail. We do that, and we can significantly improve the situation in our state and decrease violent crime. And we must do that. We must restore law and order and protect our state, protect all the children and families and communities in our great state. None of this matters, of course, if we can't win. I'm the only candidate that can win this race. With 1.15 million votes, the most votes ever received in a midterm election last cycle, in a very difficult cycle. Now we have the political winds at our backs, and we are announcing an initiative to reach out to diverse communities as well, and I'll talk about that in a little while.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Mr. Schultz.
I'll just on one point, Doug talks about getting 1.15 million votes last cycle, and he did get that. But as mentioned before, he was up against the weakest Attorney General candidate in Minnesota history. And Doug still lost. He lost a race that was winnable. Doug let us down in 2018. And he keeps bragging about only losing by 100,000 votes to a man credibly accused of domestic violence. We have to win in 2022. We have to have somebody who can win in places, the suburbs, the metro. And Doug was running the same campaign as last time. We can't have that. So we've got to win. To answer the question, we have to change the culture in Minnesota here. We have a fundamentally lawless culture as it stands now. We have to insist to county prosecutors, to activist judges who are letting criminals out on low bail or no bail. That is unacceptable. The Minnesota Freedom Fund is doing things that are fundamentally immoral. The result of the Freedom Fund's conduct has been people going out and recommitting the same offenses or worse offenses following them being bailed out. That is immoral. These are things that will scar people for all their lives. As Attorney General, I'm the only one who's put out a plan to beef up the nonprofit and charity division to ensure that we have the resources within that division to aggressively investigate organizations like the Freedom Fund, and that's what we'll do when I'm Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Judge Jude.
I support what they call the Bain Act in the legislature, which would get rid of the Freedom Fund. There'd be no more Freedom Fund with the Bain Act. And it is an important job of the Attorney General to regulate nonprofits. And we would absolutely have incredibly boisterous regulation of our nonprofits. Look at our Feeding Our Future. $200 million has disappeared. We need to get that back somehow. People give money to nonprofits to feed children, not to have it disappear. And that's an important job of the Attorney General. Our Attorney General was on the board of Minneapolis Community Action Program. I don't know if you remember Minneapolis Community Action Program, but it was to insulate homes in Minneapolis. People give money to insulate homes of people who need their homes insulated. The money disappeared, went down to the Caribbean or wherever. There's a pattern here. We need to regulate nonprofits, and in particular, get rid of the Minnesota Freedom Fund. I would do that.
Thank you, Judge Jude.
Mr. Schultz, you'll have this question followed by Judge Jude. Many Minnesotans are concerned about apparent racial disparities in Minnesota's criminal justice system. Do you think those disparities are real? And if so, how would you address them as Attorney General? Mr. Schultz.
Well, the fact is, I mean, there are different percentages, and we ultimately need a fact-based Attorney General's office, and right now we don't have that right now. We have an Attorney General's office who is fundamentally interested in imposing a left-wing ideology. And as Attorney General, there are disparities, and part of those disparities go to things like poverty, things like cultural issues, things like that. That said, we do need to ensure that everybody in Minnesota, whether they be rich or poor, black or white, everyone gets the same justice in Minnesota. As Attorney General, I will absolutely insist upon that. I believe that each person is created in God's image, and that's why I'm in this race. Each person is a child of God, created with certain rights. And we have to insist in the Attorney General's office that those rights are defended no matter a person's circumstances, no matter where they come from. And that's exactly what I will do in the Attorney General's office every single day.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Judge Jude.
Each person is created equal and in the image of God. And that's how we hopefully see people in court. And the court is driven by the facts. It's driven by the law. It's driven by the Constitution. If you look at Lady Justice is blindfolded, and it's just driven by the facts. I've worked very hard to keep an open mind until all the facts are in. You know, you have not only the prosecution, you have the defense. Keep an open mind until you see everything. It doesn't depend on color. It doesn't depend on sex. I mean, people complain about more men in jail than women, where that Stillwater is a lot harsher than Shakopee. That's not what drives it. What drives it is facts, the law, the Constitution, and we ask for your prayers. And that's what I think has to inform a fair decision.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Wardlow.
So as Attorney General, I will make sure that all criminal defendants, and work with county attorneys to make sure that all criminal defendants are afforded due process, regardless of race, creed, religion, or anything else. Everyone will have due process because justice must be blind. But let me tell you where the real racial disparity is, the one that has the most impact. It's the impact of violent crime, of lawlessness on our state. It's impacting folks in minority neighborhoods the most. People in North Minneapolis, people in St. Paul. Those neighborhoods are being affected. They can't send their kids to school without fearing for their lives. You all remember the story of the 6-year-old last year who was shot, hit by a stray bullet while riding home from McDonald's with her mom, eating a Happy Meal, and then later died. That should never happen in Minnesota. Never. People in those neighborhoods, diverse communities, are crying out for more law enforcement. They're crying out for criminals to be prosecuted. They want to live in safety, and this goes to how we're going to win. We're going to build on that 1.15 million votes using a plan that's based on experience and lessons learned. And part of it is this. A coalitions director for our campaign, Nathan Raditz, who is in the audience this evening, has been working for months with me on an initiative we're calling the Big Ten Alliance. We've got 10 leaders in 10 different diverse ethnic communities that we've been building up for months that are going to push our message out into those communities and reach places where the Democrats have been dominating, and we're going to bring them to our side. We're going to win this thing and retire Keith Ellison once and for all.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow.
Judge Jude, we'll start with you on the next question, then Mr. Wardlow. Recently, we've seen stories in the news of male athletes who identify as women participating in women's sports, dominating over elite women athletes, denying women and girls opportunities for scholarships and championships, and this despite the plain meaning of protections in federal Title IX for women's sports based on biological sex. Should this be allowed, and what would you do about it as Attorney General?
I support having women have women's sports, men having men's sports, and it's been, I think, a real unusual situation where you've had woke culture seep into this whole system, and you'll see that even coming into the court system, where people will come and want to change the sex on their birth certificates, for example, without having medical support to do that. And I have opposed changing a medical indication or a sex indication on birth certificates without medical support behind that. I certainly believe that women should be able to compete with women, men should be able to compete with men, and it's created a very, very, I think, troubling situation, and it even goes into our jails. I mean, you have men's sections and women's sections in jails, and it is creating, I think, havoc for our counties and for our prisons, and we need to address it. But women should be with women, men with men.
Thank you, Judge Jude. Mr. Wardlow.
So Leah Thomas was the 462nd ranked male swimmer in college athletics in our country. Competing as a woman, he ranked first. We must act to protect the integrity of women's athletics. Now, we must all have compassion, and we all do have compassion for people who suffer from gender confusion and dysphoria, certainly. But in Minnesota, too many schools, are teaching gender ideology to our children. They are violating the right of parents to direct the upbringing of their kids. Because parents, they should always be the primary and are the primary educators of kids, right? As your Attorney General, I will stand up for the rights of parents. I will stand up for the constitutional right of parents to direct the upbringing of children. I will stand up for the privacy rights of women and girls to keep men, parading as women, out of their locker rooms and showers and other facilities. And by the way, I'm the only candidate that has the experience to do this. In fact, I spent 2 full years litigating only these kinds of cases. So I know how to do it. I have been fighting this battle in courtrooms across the country, and I did it for at least 2 years, and then in other capacities longer than that. So I have the experience to get in there, stand up for our constitutional rights, and make sure women and girls are protected, and make sure all of our rights to direct the upbringing of our kids are protected as well.
They're 6, 3, and 10 months. And yes, I do get about 3 hours of sleep each night. And I want for them to have the opportunities I had growing up. For me, sports were incredibly important in terms of my human and personal development. I want for them the same opportunities that I have had. And it is outrageous. It is outrageous that those could be taken from them by this incredibly crazy ideology. This is outrageous. And so a lot of us woke up, feel like we woke up over the past few years and the country changed beneath us. Whether it be suddenly, things like this, men competing in women's sports, people seriously getting behind defunding our police, people defending things like partial birth abortion. The fact is, we are dealing with some incredibly crazy things. And we need people to recognize that. And the problem right now isn't that we don't have an effective constitutional litigator in the Attorney General's office. The fact is he just believes the wrong things. And the fact is we need somebody who can win this race to protect women swimmers, to defend their rights under Title IX and otherwise to defend their rights to stand up for those who don't have anybody to stand up for them. And that's exactly what I'll do.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Judge Jude, will come back to you for the first response on this next question as well. Then Mr. Wardlow. Many in our audience are people of faith for whom a candidate's disposition toward faith is a factor they consider in voting. What role does faith in God play in your approach to law and law enforcement?
When I take my oath of office, I take it on the Bible, and it informs my decision. Certainly, when I had the opportunity to be in the courtroom, I lived and breathed the courtroom the last 11 years, and I would ask for divine guidance constantly. There were many times when we had sentencing decisions, certainly in conducting trials, I asked for divine guidance. And I would do that as Attorney General. I would ask for your prayers, and I would pray. And I think you need both. Now, I know we've had discussion of who's electable, who's not electable. I've won 10 elections in suburban areas. I think I've gone through the gauntlet in suburban areas and in Hennepin County and in the 8 counties of the 10th Judicial District, in 5 races for the Minnesota House, 2 for the state Senate. The other 2 candidates have won 1 race combined. And I believe I've been through the test. And I would add credibility to the ticket.
Thank you, Judge Jude. Mr. Wardlow.
So I am a devout Christian, and that informs everything I do, including my practice of law. The law is, the eternal law and the natural law are ordained by God. And we have positive law that humans create, and to the extent that those laws don't agree with the natural law and the eternal law, they're not truly laws at all. And that's just the fact of the matter, and that's what I believe. Now, how does this affect how I will be Attorney General? Let me tell you this. Religious freedom is a bedrock freedom in our country. I've spent my entire legal career fighting for religious freedom, fighting for free speech, fighting for our right to worship God in the manner we see fit, and to live our lives according to our sincerely held religious beliefs, and to worship God in the public square, not behind closed doors, not just at home, but to do it in the public square. I've been engaged in litigation across the country to do this. One situation in Belle Plaine, Minnesota, a group of veterans got together and they decided to erect a memorial in the city park featuring a silhouette of a soldier kneeling by a cross. A group out of Massachusetts came in, they threatened to sue the city. The city caved, they took the cross off the statue. Well, we fought back. With colleagues at Alliance Defending Freedom, I went to Belle Plaine, we fought back, stood up for the First Amendment, and we won. We were able to get that cross and the memorial put back up in that city park. So I have a record of standing up for religious freedom. You know that I'll do it as your Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Mr. Schultz.
So many of you know, actually, I was in seminary for 2 years, shortly after high school. My faith is the fundamental animating purpose of my life. I believe I'm a child of God. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And that informs everything that I do. And I believe that each person is a child of God, born with inalienable rights that are fundamental to who they are, that must be defended. And those rights are reflected in our Constitution. The right to freedom of speech, to freedom of religion, to worship and act in accordance with the dictates of our faith. Fundamental rights guaranteed to us by our Constitution in accordance with natural law. And so my faith animates everything I do. I got into this race because I felt called to this race. In a lot of ways, it didn't make a lot of sense for me personally. I've got three young girls, a wife who would prefer a husband home every Saturday and home every night. But I got in because our state is in trouble. We're in a dark time, and we need good people to stand up, defend it, take it back. That's why I'm in this race, because I was called to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz.
For our next question, we'll begin with Judge Jude first, followed by Mr. Schultz. The Attorney General sits on the state's executive council and has to sign off on actions by the governor when he exercises emergency powers. How would things have been different in Governor Walz's response to COVID-19 if you had been on the executive council? In addition, what is your view on the legality of mask and vaccine mandates? Judge Jude?
I believe the Executive Council has failed the state in terms of handling the whole pandemic response of Governor Walz. And part of that is they've just acted as a rubber stamp. Anything the governor has asked for has basically been given a rubber stamp by our Executive Council. There's no meaningful discussion of any policy issues there. And that's not the role of the Executive Council. If I were Attorney General, there would absolutely be meaningful discussion of public policy in the Executive Council. There would be some disagreement, and I believe we would restrict the governor's ability in a meaningful way. And the governor's response has just been pathetic. I can't have any other word for it. He did not include the legislature in a meaningful way. He did not include, I believe, at least half the citizens of the state in a meaningful way. It certainly was very, I think, discouraging to the faith community, and it would have been a far different response if I had been on the Executive Council.
Thank you, Judge Jude. Mr. Schultz.
So my name is Jim Schultz. Keith Ellison is Sergeant Schultz. He hears nothing, he sees nothing, he knows nothing. That's the fact. Whether it comes to Tim Walz's executive orders or the crime on our streets, we have an Attorney General uninterested in enforcing the law. And the fact is, when I'm Attorney General, I would not be an accomplice to Keith Ellison, to Tim Walz violating our constitutional rights. That's exactly what Keith Ellison was. I would stand up to Tim Walz to insist that our laws be upheld. And I would stand up to President Biden or another Democratic president. The fact is, Joe Biden's vaccine mandate, working through OSHA, was fundamentally unconstitutional and unlawful. It was an absolute outrage. And we need to stand up and say it and defend it. As Attorney General, I would have joined the many lawsuits from across the country from other attorneys general interested in defending the constitutional rights of their people. I would have done the same for Minnesotans. Think how different the past 4 years would have been if we had a Republican attorney general to stand up for the rights of every single Minnesotan. And what we need in the Executive Council, Tad, is not only discussion. we can have some good discussion. We need to insist upon the laws of our state and the United States Constitution being upheld. That's exactly what I would do.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Wardlow.
So, were I on the Executive Council, things would have gone very differently. I would have absolutely insisted that our laws be followed and the Constitution be followed. That probably would not have been enough, because the Executive Council would have been dominated by Democrats. Next thing, the Attorney General has the inherent authority to bring civil lawsuits, any civil lawsuit the Attorney General thinks is in the best interest of the state. So I would have sued the governor. I would have sued the state of Minnesota, the governor of the state of Minnesota. And I would have sued the Secretary of State when he stepped out of line and waived enforcement of our election laws as well, by the way. I would have sued the governor, and we would have stood up for our rights. Minnesota statute actually speaks to this. Under Minnesota statute section 12.39, it actually speaks and says that the people of Minnesota have a fundamental right to refuse medical treatments and to refuse taking a vaccine. So the statutes speak about this. So we have strong legal arguments. The OSHA mandate, that was ridiculous, it was unconstitutional. I would have fought against that, joined with other attorney generals to do it. I mean, that rule put out by OSHA, that policy put out by OSHA, it usurped power from the legislative branch and brought it over to the president. It usurped power from the states and brought it up to the federal government. It was unconstitutional in about 15 different ways. It was also ultra-virus. We would have fought against that, and I will be there to fight for your constitutional rights. I know how to do it because I'm a constitutional lawyer. I've been doing it for my whole legal career.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow.
This next question will be our last before the break. Right after this question, we'll collect the straw ballots, completed straw ballots. If you've not completed yours, please do so during this question and the answers. And it's going to be a short break, so you may want to stay close to your seat.
All right, for this.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Mr. Wardlow, you can go first on this question, followed by Judge Jude. Lisa Hansen owned a wine and beer bar in Albert Lea. She ignored Governor Walz's shutdown orders and was fined $9,000 by Attorney General Ellison for opening her business early on in the pandemic. Hansen was also ordered to serve 90 days in jail. Would you have handled the case differently, and if so, why? How? Mr. Wardlow?
It's a travesty and a miscarriage of justice that Keith Ellison would impose the governor's unconstitutional lockdown edicts and go to the extent of jailing a business owner in Albert Lea. That is terrible, unconscionable, unconstitutional, violated her constitutional rights, her economic freedom. As Attorney General, I will stand up for economic freedom. I'll stand up for all of our rights and defend all of our constitutional rights vigorously in court and in the court of public opinion. It's absolutely essential that we stand up for constitutional rights. Lisa Hansen was treated poorly. Lisa Hansen needs justice. As Attorney General, I will be there to go to court and to defend our constitutional rights and to stop any kind of unconstitutional mandate the governor might put down. And whenever the governor steps out of line and does anything unconstitutional, I will be there to stand up and push back against him. And you know, the last time we had a Republican Attorney General was in 1966 to 70. 52 years. That's the amount of time we haven't had one. It takes a little while to build up a base and to win that office back after such a long time. We are on the path to victory. And the last Attorney General who was a Republican, his name was Doug Head. So I think it's time for another Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Judge Jude?
No, Lisa Hansen was, I think, unfairly prosecuted. I believe the Attorney General should work with small business as opposed to making an example of small business. And in this case, I think Lisa Hansen was prosecuted as an example, and that's, again, not a good basis for bringing a criminal prosecution. I would see the Attorney General as trying to work with small business. Obviously, you've got businesses that are applying the law in different ways, complying with the law in different ways. The Attorney General needs to work with them, make sure that everybody can prosper. That would be part of the role of the Attorney General's office, to try to see people succeed and do so in a way that allows them to stay out of jail. That's what I try to do.
Thank you, Judge Jude. Mr. Schultz?
So the average person looks at the past few years and says, how is it possible that an entire street in Minneapolis was burned to the ground with few or no prosecutions? and a woman who opens up her restaurant, tries to provide a service and pay to her employees, is prosecuted aggressively and put in prison by our Attorney General. That is an outrage. It's a disgrace. And meanwhile, you've got churches being shut down while Walmart's open down the street. That is outrageous. As Attorney General, I will stand up to all of the constitutional violations that we've seen these past few years. And the fact is, a lot of politicians, they make huge promises and then they underdeliver. We've been seeing that for 20, 30, 40 years. I'm not a politician. I got into this race because we're losing the state I grew up in and we're losing the country I grew up in. We need to take it back. And the fact is, the same old politicians have been making the same promises for the past 20, 30, 40 years. And look where our state is at. We've got to win in 2022. I've made my career in the private sector. In the private sector, you win every day or you go out of business. And when I'm Attorney General, we're going to win every day. As President Trump would say, there's got to be so much winning, you're going to get tired of all the winning. That's what we'll do. That's what we have to do for the future of Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz.
We will now excuse the candidates from the stage for the break, and the audience can get to work on those straw ballots. Thank you.
If you've not already completed your straw ballot, please do so now. We've got volunteers coming down the aisles with baskets to collect them. If you're at the end of a row on the outside end and there is no volunteer to collect your basket, please pass it to the row in front of or behind you. Thank you. And please take your seats. This will use up our time for that last question.
We're back now from our break, and we are ready to get started on our next question. Mr. Schultz, we're going to start with you, followed by Mr. Wardlow. Concerns have been raised for years about the integrity of elections in Minnesota, including allegations of fraudulent voting. What are your views on the integrity of elections in this state, and what would you do as AG to ensure election integrity? Mr. Schultz.
So we have to do three things on election integrity. Number one, we have to aggressively prosecute election fraud in our state. It's so fundamental, and nobody seems to care about it amongst the Democrats. We have to partner with county attorneys in Minnesota to ensure that in Minnesota, you commit election fraud, you spend meaningful time in prison. We need it, we have to insist upon it, and I will do so. Number two, the fact is, in 2020, it was absolutely outrageous that we had a Secretary of State and Attorney General collaborate to change our election laws completely undemocratically. That's wrong. And that absolutely has to stop going forward. And instead of being an accomplice for for Steve Simon, the next time he's planning to change our election laws, I'll be walking down the street the very next day to file the lawsuit to stop him. It's outrageous, and we have to stand up to it in Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Wardlow.
One more. A few seconds, if that's okay. We need voter ID in this state. It is absolutely outrageous. In order to walk into a St. Paul bar up until a few weeks ago, you had to show your Vax card and your ID. It's unbelievable that you don't need to do so in order to exercise the sacred obligation of voting.
And Mr. Wardlow.
So many of you probably already know that I am general counsel at MyPillow, so I'm involved in some litigation around this area. And be that as it may, you also know then that I take election integrity very seriously. In my job at MyPillow, I'm standing up for the First Amendment right of all Americans, all Minnesotans, to speak our minds on matters of public concern, like election integrity, without being silenced by the left, silenced or threatened by agents of the government that count the ballots, like Dominion Voting Systems and other companies. That's important work. We'll continue the work of standing up for our First Amendment rights when I'm Attorney General. In addition to that, you know that I will investigate and prosecute voter fraud. We will send the message that if you commit voter fraud or election fraud in the state of Minnesota, you will go to jail. Once we put a few people in prison for rigging elections, I think that will change behaviors. That's how we get secure elections in our state. And then we take the evidence that we receive and develop in those prosecutions, we give it to the legislature to the extent that we can, and then that will help us pass important election law reforms like voter ID, like provisional balloting. We need to make those changes so we can have a secure election state here in Minnesota. That is fundamentally important. It will be a top priority when I'm Attorney General. We're going to dedicate a unit in the office to prosecuting voter fraud, investigating, and pushing for election integrity.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Judge Jude.
I would establish a division in the Attorney General's office dedicated to election integrity. And they would work with the Attorney General's office, working with Secretary of State, State Auditor, to ensure that we have confidence in the results of our elections. We do that by having voter ID. I absolutely support having voter ID. Secondly, I believe we need paper ballots. We need to have something that can be traced. And I'd work very hard just to make sure that we don't have a repeat of what you saw in Hennepin County. You saw, I believe, hundreds of people registered out of post office boxes in parts of Minneapolis. You had part of the election returns brought in one car, hundreds of ballots brought in by one car in the city of Minneapolis. That has to stop. We have a 45-day window to go vote. That has to be compressed somehow, I believe, to ensure voter integrity. Too many things happen in a campaign during those last 45 days and too many opportunities for problems arise with the current system.
Thank you, Judge Jude. Mr. Wardlow, you can respond first to this question, followed by Mr. Schultz. As many as 86% of predators caught and convicted of possessing and producing child sexual abuse imagery in Minnesota receive only probation, with minimal to no time in prison. As Attorney General, what would you do to ensure that those convicted of these offenses would receive a just sentence? Mr. Wardlow.
This is a terrible problem in Minnesota and across the country. It's one the Democrats have been ignoring. People that are convicted of these offenses get off on light sentences, and that is completely improper. Human trafficking is a terrible plague that afflicts every part of our state. Sex trafficking, human trafficking, labor trafficking, that needs to stop. When I'm Attorney General, it will stop. We're going to build a unit within the office. We're going to bring in veteran prosecutors who have expertise in human trafficking and related crimes. And we are going to send them out to our county attorneys so they can do the investigations, find out who are doing these things, and we can bring prosecutions aggressively against those criminals. And then we will support the county attorneys in doing those prosecutions, seeking maximum sentences, upward departures in the presumptive sentences, and making sure that these crimes are punished. We will end human trafficking, sex trafficking in the state of Minnesota. We will make sure that sentences are imposed that reflect justice. And this is an imperative, and I've been talking about this issue for 5 years. And it's good that some people are starting to talk about it now, and everybody in this room has been. The Star Tribune, they never want to talk about it, but they're a little bit biased. And so we will do this, and we'll fix this problem in Minnesota when I am Attorney General. And we're going to win this race, and we're going to make sure that Minnesota is safe once again for our children and our families.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Mr. Schultz.
So this issue hits home for me. I've got 3 little girls, 6, 3, and 10 months. And when I think of what this crime means to so many young children in our state, it makes me sick, as I'm sure it does for many people in this room. I'm the only candidate on this stage to publicly support the Protect Minnesota Kids Act. We put out a statement in support of it. I've spoken extensively with the Child Protection League regarding the issue. It is outrageous that in Minnesota, the vast majority of individuals convicted of these incredibly serious and despicable crimes get probation. That is outrageous. And as Minnesota Attorney General, I will aggressively prosecute these crimes. I will work with the legislature to ensure we have adequate sentencing guidelines and minimum sentences to ensure that if you commit these vile crimes in Minnesota, you go to prison for a long time. Our children deserve it. Our children deserve it. And as Attorney General, I will insist that they get that justice. We must have it in Minnesota, and I will insist upon it.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Judge Jude.
Child pornography, I believe, is a heinous and grievous crime. And I've worked in the legislature to make the penalties more serious and that they'd be applied more fairly. Now, we've had a big problem, I think, with trafficking, child trafficking. Part of that is because of porous borders. Part of it is, I believe, of unfair and just lax prosecution in the suburban area. And unfortunately, one of the attorneys that was assigned to that was Miranda Lee, the attorney that resigned because of politics and vitriol in Washington County. I would support having a sex crime unit in county attorneys' offices and through the Attorney General's office that would vigorously prosecute and hold those that are offenders accountable. That's what I would support.
Thank you, Judge Jude.
Mr. Schultz, we'll go with you first on the next question, followed by Judge Jude. Physicians and other health professionals have been threatened with loss of employment or licenses for challenging approved treatments for COVID-19 and prescribing other treatments that have been beneficial. Are such threats lawful? What can and should the Attorney General do to ensure that medical professionals are free to provide the best care available for their patients?
It starts with the tone at the top. Again, we live in a crazy world where you can burn down a half a city street in Minneapolis with a few repercussions. But you're a doctor exercising your judgment as a doctor, and you can be investigated and so forth. We need to insist that in Minnesota, people have the freedom to seek medical care, to receive medical care that they desire. The vaccine mandate is outrageous. The fact is, we need to ensure that in Minnesota, people have the medical freedom and they have the personal freedoms they are entitled to under the Constitution and under our applicable state statute. To the extent any action by regulatory bodies or others violates Minnesota law, I will aggressively stand up to the regulatory bodies or otherwise to ensure that every Minnesotan's rights are protected in the Minnesota Attorney General's office.
Mr. Schultz, Judge Jude.
It's important that we have a governor with common sense. One of the problems we've had with different licensing boards in Minnesota is that I believe they have adopted a political type agenda in regulating their professions. And we've seen that in the medical profession, you've seen it in the legal profession, and you've seen it in a few other areas. And politics, of course, should have nothing to do with your professional capacity and your professional licenses. And that's why we need to have a governor with common sense that appoints good people to the licensing boards. And that's particularly, I think, applicable in terms of medicine. The Hippocratic Oath has changed over the years. I think it's changed because of politics. That's not what should be governing the Hippocratic Oath. And it shouldn't be governing our licensing boards. But unfortunately, it's had an undue impact. I think politics has had an undue impact on our licensing boards. I'm concerned about that. That's why we need common sense in our governor.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Wardlow.
So the Attorney General has general authority and jurisdiction over all of our state agencies and can exert significant influence over licensing boards as well, including the State Board of Medical Practice. And that's very important. Consider the Minnesota Department of Health. What are they doing? We have hospital protocols in place around Minnesota that basically force doctors to go along with treatment protocols that lead to patient deaths and prevent doctors from prescribing life-saving treatments for COVID. This is terrible. The Department of Health should be investigating that, should be dealing with that. The Attorney General's office needs to investigate the Department of Health and those hospital protocols, and that's what I will do as Attorney General. We will not have another situation like we did with Scott Quiner, who was defended by Marjorie Holstein and moved to Texas after he was stuck in a hospital here in Minnesota. When he got to Texas, unfortunately he passed away. It was too late for him. But down in Texas, the doctors were appalled. They said, what were they doing to him up in Minnesota? The Attorney General has been asleep at the wheel. He's been too busy fighting his war against the police and pushing a radical political agenda with that office. We will end that. We will start investigating these agencies, and we will stand up for medical freedom.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. You can go first on the next question, followed by Mr. Schultz. Parents in Minnesota and across the country have come under fire for objecting to the inclusion of critical race theory, gender ideology, and other subject matters in schools, even going so far as to be labeled domestic terrorists by government. What can and should the Attorney General do to protect parents' rights to oversee curriculum?
Absolutely. We need to protect parents' rights to direct the upbringing of their children. Parents are the primary educators of their children. Full stop. Now, as Attorney General, I will act to uphold those constitutional rights of parents. Critical race theory, it's terrible, it's evil. It teaches kids to judge others based on the color of their skin. It's Martin Luther King Jr. turned upside down, but you know what? It's also illegal. Because when a teacher creates a hostile environment in a classroom that discriminates on the basis of race, that violates our state anti-discrimination laws, and it violates our federal anti-discrimination laws. So as your Attorney General, I will investigate school districts and school boards that are employing critical race theory and creating hostile environments that discriminate on the basis of race. We will counsel them to stop. If they won't, we will sue them, and we will end critical race theory in Minnesota. We are also going to stand up for the rights of parents with respect to gender ideology. None of that stuff should be taught to any children, right? That is a subject for parents to teach their children. We're going to stand up for those rights vehemently. And I know how to do this. I'm the only candidate on this stage that has a proven track record of fighting for just these exact constitutional rights in cases all across the country. We need somebody with experience who knows how to do this, who can get in there and start taking on day one those bold steps that are necessary to save the state of Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Mr. Schultz.
So the threats to parents' rights go back many years. We've seen throughout the years in which gradually the rights of parents to be parents to their kids have been dramatically eroded. And politicians have been absent. They've been dramatically absent. And the fact is that CRT is just the tip of the iceberg. Just the tip of the iceberg. CRT is wrong. I will fight it every day that I am Attorney General to the extent it is present in Minnesota's schools. Every student is equal based on the content of their character and the fact that they're a child of God. And as Attorney General, I will stand up for that every single day. But the fact is, there's lots of politicians talking about all these things that go back much, much farther than just the past couple years of CRT and so forth. Where were they as we went through this period over the past 20 years in which far-left sociology was inserted into American curriculums? Where were they? They certainly weren't standing up, or at least they weren't effective in standing up. We need bold people from outside to articulate that in Minnesota, parental rights are paramount, and we don't get to have kids raised by the public school teachers. That's wrong, and I will stand up for it.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Judge Jude.
I've been a supporter of parents being involved in their children's education from day one. And Minnesota, in fact, in some ways, has been a leader in terms of having charter schools, giving parents some opportunity to be involved in their children's education. But we have to do far more. And it's more of I believe, a question for gubernatorial candidates in terms of allowing parents to be involved in their children's education, supporting the choice of private education, homeschooling, and many other good alternatives to our public school system. Our public school system, at least in the core cities, has failed so many parents, has failed so many students, have deprived them the opportunities that students need to succeed, the tools they need to succeed in our economy and having a good family. And the key, I believe, to a children's future is the education and their family, the education that their families are able to provide. And I will support every way to have the families involved in their children's education.
Thank you, Judge Jude. Mr. Schultz, you can answer first, followed by Judge Jude. In Telescope Media, the Eighth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals ruled that the state's attempt under the Minnesota Human Rights Act to force a videographer to film a same-sex wedding violated the First Amendment. As Attorney General, how would you enforce this principle and ensure that religious freedom is protected from overreach by the state?
Well, religious freedom is paramount in our Constitution, in the First Amendment for a reason. It is a fundamental right, not just to worship. Democrats like to focus on the right to worship. No, it's a right to act in accordance with the dictates of your faith. And that is being eroded in many areas. You see it with pharmacists being forced to prescribe abortion drugs. You see it in many areas in which the rights to exercise your rights of faith, freedom of religion, are being undermined in our country. And as Attorney General, I will aggressively stand up and defend those rights, whether they be from the federal government, from the state government, or municipal governments. And the fact is, the Attorney General doesn't walk into a courtroom every day. The Attorney General manages in office 150 people, 150 attorneys, and many others. And they may walk into the courtroom occasionally, but the fact is, what we need somebody in that office is somebody who can fundamentally reform the office. It's been run by Democrats for 55 years, and believe me, there's going to be some things to be found in the rocks we uncover there. But when I'm the Attorney General, I will run that office, I will reform the office, and get it done. And we need to win. We can't have these circumstances where we have a winnable election and blow it. We've had a lot of those in recent years in Minnesota elections. We've got to win, and that's exactly what I'll do.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Judge Jude.
I'm the candidate, I believe, that will be seen as most credible and most electable and will win. And it doesn't hurt to know the courtroom. It doesn't hurt to know how a jury trial works. It doesn't hurt to know how a trial works. It doesn't hurt to have that experience. If you look at what the Attorney General's been doing, they've had jury trials. I don't know if the other candidates up here have seen a jury trial, but jury trials are an important aspect of being Attorney General. Knowing how the court system works is an important aspect of being the Attorney General. And also recognizing religious liberty is an important aspect of being Attorney General. Our Attorney General sued the Little Sisters of the Poor. That isn't a good way to help poor people. He didn't agree with their religious beliefs. That doesn't make any sense. You should have the ability to freely exercise your religion. If you look at our Supreme Court chambers in the state capitol, you'll see Moses getting the 10 Commandments over the bench of our Supreme Court. That has to be recognized by our Attorney General.
Thank you, Judge Jude. Mr. Wardlow.
The Telescope Media case was a huge victory for religious freedom, and it was brought by my colleagues at Alliance Defending Freedom. And I actually had the honor of working a little bit on that case and helping win that victory for religious freedom. So a lot of politicians talk. I have been acting. I've been fighting this fight for religious freedom for many, many years now, and I have the experience to do this. Let me tell you about another case. Judge Ruth Neely, a town judge in Pinedale, Wyoming, population 2,000. A few years ago, she was hanging Christmas lights one evening, and she got a call from a reporter. The reporter asked her if she would be performing same-sex weddings in light of the recent court decision on marriage. Judge Ruth Neely is a devout Christian, and she said no, she couldn't do that, but she would refer someone to another magistrate who could. She didn't actually refuse to do anyone's marriage. She just stated her religious beliefs. Well, for that, the Wyoming Judicial Conduct Commission went after her. They tried to remove her from the bench. My colleagues and I at Alliance Defending Freedom, we fought back. We went to Wyoming. We represented Judge Neely. We went to the Supreme Court in Wyoming, and we won. We were able to make sure that Judge Neely kept her judgeship. And so you know, as your Attorney General, I will stand up for religious freedom. I will intervene in cases wherever necessary. We will bring friend of the court briefs. We will bring cases on behalf of the state when necessary and appropriate. And we will make sure that religious freedom is not violated in the state of Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow.
Judge Jude, you can begin, followed by Mr. Schultz. What areas of criminal justice system, the arrest, prosecution, and conviction process, do you see as the biggest possibility for reform? Where do you think change is needed most? Judge Jude?
Well, the criminal justice system has many different aspects, and you've touched on a few of them here. And certainly, I think the whole arresting process, prosecution process, probably the prosecution process, needs more accountability through the system. And you have that with the county attorneys. County attorneys are elected. They have to work with the Attorney General. I think the Attorney General needs to work with the county attorneys to make sure that cases are prosecuted in an even-handed way, and that justice is accountable. In addition, I think you have to hold judges accountable. Now, when judges make decisions, they can be appealed. You have the Court of Appeals. That's some accountability. You have the Board of Judicial Standards. There's some accountability. There's also elections. Don't forget about judicial elections. I think that's an area where you need to hold judges accountable as well. More than anything else, you need a good governor so that we have common sense on the bench. Good to do it.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Schultz?
Can I have the question one more time?
What areas of the criminal justice system, the arrest, prosecution, and conviction process, do you see as the biggest possibility for reform? Where do you think change is needed most?
Well, fundamentally, what will do more good to deal with the crime issues in our state than anything else is to support our law enforcement. We have to support our law enforcement. I've done it as a member of the Frontline Foundation, a board member leading that organization. I'm happy to have earned the support of the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association, the only person with a law enforcement endorsement in this race. We have to support law enforcement. And one thing we have to recognize here is that everybody's talking about criminals' rights and so forth, and we'll respect those when I'm the Attorney General. But what about the rights of victims? My own sister who's here with us tonight, she woke up one morning to gunshots immediately outside her home. A man had careened his car into her yard. He was on a chase with police. He was shooting out his back windows at police who were returning fire. It's a long story from there, but there were multiple bullet holes in my sister's home at the end of it. I remember her calling me and crying that morning. That's what Minneapolis has become. And the fact is, we have men and women and children being killed every day on the streets of Minneapolis. That is a disgrace. 100 murders in Minneapolis, 600 carjackings, crime and violence bleeding out to the suburbs. That is outrageous, and as Attorney General, I will fight it. I will ensure that in Minnesota, we have a safe state again.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Wardlow?
So there are many parts of the criminal justice system that can certainly be improved. But as Attorney General, it will be my job to enforce the law, and to do so even-handedly, respecting due process for all defendants, including police officer defendants. We're not going to take over cases from county attorneys just to put on a political show for our narrow political base, like Keith Ellison has been doing, waging his war against the police. No, we're going to end the war against the police. And that's going to help us retain and recruit officers in departments across the state of Minnesota, police departments across the state of Minnesota, and sheriff's departments across the state of Minnesota as well. They're having trouble filling open slots. There is a massive attrition. Officers are retiring. Officers are retiring early. Officers are resigning. And it's a terrible problem. Lawlessness in our state will continue to grow. It will get worse and worse and worse unless we turn things around. As Attorney General, you can count on me to turn things around. We're going to change the entire tone. There are about 36 or so political appointees in the Office of Attorney General. So we can go in there and on day one, it doesn't matter if they're Democrats or Republicans, but we're going to find folks that are committed to the rule of law, to law and order and the Constitution. We're going to bring them in, and we're going to set a new tone for the office and set a new tone for the state of Minnesota. We're going to prosecute criminals aggressively and work with county attorneys to do it. We're going to make sure that law-breaking in Minnesota has consequences once again. We're going to clean up our state, and I will not rest until Minnesota is once again safe for our families and for our children and for all of our communities.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Mr. Wardlow, you can go first, followed by Judge Jude. Immigration is primarily a matter of federal law. Some cities within our state refuse to cooperate with enforcement of immigration laws. What do you see as the role of the Minnesota Attorney General in this matter, and what would you do about sanctuary cities? Mr. Wardlow?
So yes, immigration law is a matter of federal law. But sanctuary cities, political subdivisions of the state, are standing up and they are violating federal law. They are saying they will not follow federal law. And as the top legal officer of the state and the chief law enforcement official in the state, as Attorney General, I will be there to not stand up not only for state law, but to the extent that it doesn't violate or conflict with state law, federal law as well. And we need to look out for the interests of all the people of Minnesota, including those interests that are harmed when sanctuary cities violate our federal immigration laws. So we can look at a number of different things. The Attorney General has the inherent authority to bring any civil lawsuit that the Attorney General deems is in the best interest of the people of the state of Minnesota. So we could look at civil lawsuits to go after sanctuary cities and make sure that they are complying with the law. We also have jurisdiction over all of the different state agencies, so we can look into those, and nonprofits as well. Catholic charity, other nonprofits are bringing in illegal immigrants into our state. So as Attorney General, I will aggressively investigate those nonprofits and make sure they are not violating any laws, state or federal. If they are, we will go after them. We will see to it that they are prosecuted, and we will stand up for secure borders and stand up for our federal immigration laws as well.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Judge Jude?
The Attorney General isn't directly involved with immigration. However, certainly indirectly, the Attorney General has a big impact on immigration. You have a situation where jails oftentimes will cooperate or won't cooperate with the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. I would encourage and work to make sure that jails are cooperating with all of our federal law enforcement units, and that would include the INS. And it does impact Minnesota. I mean, you've probably heard of the family that froze trying to go across the border in northern Minnesota just a month ago. And that was a terrible tragedy. And it's a porous border. And the Border Patrol and the immigration services need to be supported so that we do have a border. Our Attorney General is famous for advocating no borders, not having a border. When it comes to trafficking, that's a big problem. And, I, for the life of me, have a hard time understanding how the governor allowed Christopher Columbus to be torn down on the Capitol Mall. That was a symbol of immigration in many minds. I guess it depends on where you immigrate from. Anyway,
Thank you, Judge.
I will support Immigration and Naturalization Service.
Mr. Schultz.
Great issue that represents the complete failure of our political class. You know, Tad, you've been around in politics since Richard Nixon. Doug, you've been around for a while as well. And what has been accomplished over the past 20, 30, 40 years? What we've seen is our borders being walked over dramatically more, not less. We've seen the politicians completely fail us. And what we need is people to stand up and say it is unacceptable to have a nation in which borders are not secure. It is unacceptable to have a nation in which laws are not enforced. That's what I will insist upon when I'm the Attorney General. And we can talk, politicians talk all the time about all they're going to do when they're in office. Well, where have they been over the past 15 years as millions of people have unlawfully come into our country? There were opportunities to deal with this. There were opportunities to write state statutes dealing with things like sanctuary cities and otherwise. Where were the politicians? I come from the private sector. To me, results matter, and records matter. And the fact is, politicians' records on this issue have been horrendous. We need to have an Attorney General who gets things done. That's what I will do every single day.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. And you can go first on this next question, followed by Mr. Wardlow. First Amendment rights are often infringed on college campuses, including in Minnesota. How will you work to protect basic rights of speech, religion, assembly, and association on Minnesota's public college campuses? Mr. Schultz?
Well, public colleges, subject to state statute, and of course, every college campus is subject to the United States Constitution. And so, I will insist upon them respecting the rights of their students. And there are a lot of threats to free speech, freedom of religion, coming today. Whether it be from the federal government, we see that continually. We see it from state governments. We see it from state entities like our public schools. Our public schools, as we all know, are bastions of illiberal thought, and that is crippling to academic communities, that is crippling to children, and to children, young men and women who are in this incredibly formative time of their lives. So as Attorney General, I will insist upon them respecting the constitutional rights of their students. And the fact is, if to the extent the rights to freedom of assembly, which we frequently see undermined by conservative groups not being allowed to meet on campus, the rights of freedom of religion, where we see frequently where individuals are not allowed to assemble on campus, to exercise their rights to the freedom of religion, or otherwise, we see the rights continually undermined. And I will work with county attorneys. I will bring suit to ensure that in Minnesota, the constitutional rights of every Minnesotan are defended every single day.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Wardlow?
So yes, public universities are state actors and therefore subject to the guarantees of the First Amendment. Congress can make no law abridging freedom of speech or free exercise of religion, and et cetera, right? As your Attorney General, I will make sure that those rights are upheld. But actions speak louder than words. Politicians have failed us. That's why I'm running. Where have I been over the last decade? I have been fighting for religious freedom. I have been fighting for free speech. I have been in courtrooms fighting for free speech. I have been working for nonprofits. I have been in the legislature fighting for these principles as well. I am a proven, battle-tested warrior for our conservative principles and for free speech and for religious liberty. I know how to fight these cases. I know how to win these cases. I have worked on cases involving free speech on campuses with colleagues at Alliance Defending Freedom. I will be there as your Attorney General to stand up for the rights of students on public university campuses, students fighting against speech codes on other universities, and we will vindicate those rights. I will intervene in cases where appropriate, file friend of the court briefs where appropriate, come alongside private plaintiffs where appropriate, and bring lawsuits on behalf of the states where appropriate. We will push back against the federal government as well, or any state university or any institution or part of the government that violates or threatens to violate our constitutional rights, including free speech, including religious liberty. I know how to do this. I've been doing it for my entire legal career.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Judge Jude.
Well, I'm a strong supporter of the First Amendment, certainly on college campuses, which you're supposed to have the crucible of ideas. That's where you're to think about different thoughts, different discussions. I've actually, during a campaign, I was actually, the county attorney, Mike Freeman, brought a lawsuit against me for political speech. Of course, it was thrown out by the court on the basis of a First Amendment. I'm a strong supporter of the First Amendment. Now, one of the candidates asked, where have you been? Well, I've been, a husband, a father, grandfather. I've started 2 small family businesses that are ongoing today. I don't know of any other candidate up here who can say that. I've been a member of the 523rd Army Security Agency for 6 years. I don't know if there are any other veterans up here on the stage. I've been a district court judge the last 11 years. I've been seeing the problems that people have come into the courtroom day after day after day, not as an abstract concept, but in real life. That's where I've been.
Judge, thank you.
Judge Jude, you can answer first, followed by Mr. Wardlow. The Feeding Our Future scandal has made headlines for months, with the program accused of stealing nearly $50 million in federal nutrition aid and spending it on trips and luxury homes. As Attorney General, how will you deal with fraud in state agencies? Judge Jude.
Well, for one thing, Feeding Our Future has been shut down. There is a court action in Dakota County, and any assets that are recoverable should be clawed back, and clawed back immediately. People need to have confidence that when they give money to feed children, that it goes to the children. People need to have confidence that when they contribute money to insulate homes, that it goes to insulate homes. That hasn't happened under the watch of our Attorney General. We have to have an Attorney General's office that can regulate effectively nonprofits, working with the state auditor and working with other state agencies to ensure that people have confidence that giving to nonprofits goes for their intended purpose. That includes the Philandro Castillo project over in St. Paul, which got the perpetrator of that got off far too lightly.
Judge Jude. Mr. Wardlow.
Feed Our Future scandal is a terrible travesty, and Keith Ellison has been asleep at the wheel. It is the job of the Attorney General to oversee and have jurisdiction over all of the nonprofits in the state, and I will exercise that jurisdiction aggressively and investigate nonprofits and make sure that funds are going where they're supposed to go. And if they're not, and if people are violating the law, we'll see to it that they are prosecuted. The Attorney General also has the statutory authority. One of the few areas where the Attorney General has statutory authority to actually take action without input from anyone else and prosecute a crime is in the area of welfare fraud. So as Attorney General, I will aggressively investigate welfare fraud and prosecute welfare fraud, including child daycare subsidies and fraud with respect to that, and any other kind of fraud going on in respect to our state agencies or welfare fraud across the state of Minnesota. That's an important part of the job of Attorney General. Of course, none of this matters if we can't win. I am the only candidate that can win this race. Repeat candidates win in Minnesota. Jim Hagedorn, late Jim Hagedorn, he ran twice, lost twice, before he won on his third try. The first time he lost by 9 points and then lost by 1 point. On the third try, he won. And I was honored to receive his endorsement a couple of months before he passed. John Klein, congressman for 14 years, he lost twice and won on his third attempt. We are building a base, building off the record-setting base in the terrible political climate last time. Now the winds are at our backs, and we're going to bring this across the finish line and defeat Keith Ellison once and for all.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Mr. Schultz.
So I'm the only candidate who put out a plan to deal with the massive fraud that is in our nonprofit sector in the state. We need to dramatically increase the resources devoted to our nonprofit and charities division. Right now, it's a handful of attorneys and a few others. Right now, it's dramatically under-resourced because the Attorney General has different priorities. He prioritizes defunding the police. He prioritizes all these other things. That has to change. Well, 13% of Minnesotans are employed by nonprofits. It's a massive sector in our economy. We have to ensure that Donors, taxpayers can trust where their money is going. I have a plan to deal with it, and I will insist upon it. Finally, we have to win, and you're right, Doug, we do have to win, and we need a candidate who can win. And we've done the same thing over and over again in Minnesota. And the same career politicians saying, we're going to get it done this time. Failed candidates, career politicians saying, we're going to get it done this time, give me another chance. And yeah, sometimes somebody who fails does win the next time, but usually they run a little bit different. They fix the things they did before. I'm seeing the same thing I'm seeing the same campaign as Doug ran last time. I'm not seeing any changes. I'm seeing somebody who cannot win the votes in the metro and elsewhere needed to win in 2022, and that's exactly what we have to do.
Mr. Schultz, you can go first on this next question, followed by Mr. Wardlow. The Minnesota State Senate has advanced a bill that would limit the hiring by the Attorney General's office of outside attorneys. It comes after it has reported that Michael Bloomberg donated nearly $6 million to essentially put 11 special assistants in AG offices across the country, including in Minnesota, to drive his personal agenda. What do you think of this practice, and if elected, would you allow it to continue? Mr. Schultz.
So on day one, after I'm elected, sworn in, those attorneys are fired on day one. It has to happen. We don't privately fund litigation in our state. We don't privately fund private actors with conflicts of interest in our Attorney General's office or anywhere else for that matter. It's wrong, and it ends under my watch. Now, what we have to do fundamentally, and this goes to a deeper issue, we have a fundamentally political AG's office. We have to have an apolitical AG's office, an office where everyone gets the same justice. And by the way, we don't pursue these far left-wing causes like those hired under the Michael Bloomberg grant. That's wrong. What we need to do, it's very simple. We need to put criminals in prison. We need to defend the constitutional rights of Minnesotans, and we need to restore trust in our elections. It's very easy. That's what I'll do as Attorney General. And these attorneys are a distraction. We need to get them out of our Attorney General's office and ensure we prioritize what Minnesotans really care about.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Wardlow.
So the two special assistant attorneys general that have been appointed by Keith Ellison, whose salaries are being paid for by Michael Bloomberg, they're planted there as part of this program in order to push a radical left environmental agenda. And they're doing just that. They're abusing the power of the office of the Attorney General, using the stamp of the authority of the state to push forward a private agenda. That violates, I believe, Minnesota statute. It's also a terrible conflict of interest. They're suing ExxonMobil and the American Petroleum Institute and making the absurd claim that Minnesotans have been deceived about the truth about climate change. But regardless of what anyone thinks about the merits of that particular case, I think that's a bunch of hogwash, right? But regardless, this is a conflict of interest. It must stop. I'm going to fire those two special assistant attorneys general, and everyone, it goes without saying, will be paid for, their salaries will be paid for by the state of Minnesota because the people in the Attorney General's office do the bidding of the taxpayers of the state of Minnesota. And that's very simple. We're going to reform the office and take the politics out. Keith Ellison has transformed the office into a political weapon, and that is terrible. It undermines the rule of law itself. We have to win. We must win this race. And we have a plan to win that is based on experience and lessons learned. We are making adjustments to our campaign plan from last time. Last time, the political climate was terrible. Now it's great. Now we are reaching out into diverse communities around the metro area, 10 of them. We have leaders that we have identified. We are building the Big Ten Alliance. We are going to get votes, and we're going to bring those people over to our side and make permanent majorities in the state House and Senate and keep our statewide offices for decades to come.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Judge Jude.
I'm the candidate that has the credibility to beat Keith Ellison. We will make him a one-term Attorney General. The Attorney General's office will not be for sale when I'm Attorney General. Hyperpartisanship will stop. The special interest attorneys will be gone. They're actually placed through a New York law school, believe it or not, a New York Law School Foundation. So, if anything, they're accountable to Michael Bloomberg and a New York law school. It makes no sense that they'd be embedded in the Minnesota Attorney General office. They're not accountable to the taxpayers of Minnesota. They're not accountable to people who are setting the policy in the state of Minnesota. They'll be gone on day one when I'm Attorney General, and I will win this election.
Thank you, Judge Jude.
Our last question tonight, we will begin with Mr. Wardlow, followed by Mr. Schultz. It is time to make your final pitch with our last question. The last time, as has been mentioned a few times before, that a Republican was elected to Attorney General in Minnesota was 55 years ago. What makes you think this November that the outcome will be different? Again, Mr. Wardlow.
Well, the political winds are at our backs, and we must run hard through the finish line. And we are building on all the work that we have been doing over the past 5 years, building up name recognition across the state. We have tremendous name recognition, and that's very important because you cannot credibly go on the offense or attack your opponent until voters know who you are. My opponents are relatively unknown, and so it would cost them millions just to catch up on the name recognition front, to even begin making the attacks. But we are positioned and ready to make those attacks. We came so close to victory last time. We won Olmsted County, Rochester. We won Anoka County and Washington County, Beltrami County, 73 of our 87 counties. And we have never run a repeat candidate for Attorney General in the state of Minnesota since we lost the office. Every 4 years, we bring a new candidate in, a new face, a new name. They try something different. No one knows who they are. And every 4 years, they lose. So let's actually do something different. Let's run a good repeat candidate. Let's run a campaign based on lessons learned and experience. Let's take all the name recognition and all the things that we built up over the last 5 years with our new plan, our plan where we are reaching out into diverse communities and building up the vote among ethnic minority communities and bringing those folks over to our side as well, winning in the suburbs, focusing on the public safety message, and let's win this thing. Let's defeat Keith Ellison. Let's totally repudiate left-wing politics. Let's save the state of Minnesota for my kids and for all our children and for future generations.
Thank you, Mr. Wardlow. Mr. Schultz.
I'm a kid from a town of 186 people in rural Minnesota. I've had incredible opportunities thanks to my upbringing in Minnesota. I had the opportunity to go to Harvard Law School, had professional success that I would put on par with anybody up here on this stage. But I haven't been a politician. That makes me fundamentally different. That's what Minnesotans want. That's what they deserve. They need a fresh voice, a fresh vision in that office. Not the same old politicians that have been failing us for decades. We've got to win in 2022. And I've got something going for me that no other candidate does. I'm endorsed by the largest law enforcement organization in the state. And when I'm running in 2022, I'm going to be flanked by 10,000 police officers supporting me along the way. They're going to be supporting me every single day, and we're going to win with their support. We're going to win with a message that says it is wrong and immoral to have a chief law enforcement officer of our state back defunding the police. We're going to win with a message that says we will defend the constitutional rights of Minnesotans every single day. We're going to win with a message that says we will restore trust in our elections. That's what I'll do. We're going to win in every part of the state. We're going to shrink the margins that we've got crushed, including in 2018 and elsewhere in the metro and elsewhere. We're going to win in 2018. Please join with me, and let's get it done.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Judge Jude, you can have the last word.
Winning an election is a little bit more than just saying you're going to win an election. These two candidates have won 1 combined. I've won 10. I've won 5 races for the Minnesota House. I've won 2 for the Minnesota Senate. I've won 1 for the Hennepin County Commissioner. I won 1 against 23 other candidates for District Court Judge in the 10th Judicial District. That includes 8 counties. I've won in Hennepin County. I've got some name recognition. Some of it's good. But I've been able to deliver. I've been able to help protect unborn children. I've been able to work for tougher penalties for people who violate the law. I was chair of the House Judiciary Committee when we reworked the whole court system. We cut down the number of judges on the Minnesota Supreme Court from 9 to 7, set up the Court of Appeals, combined the municipal and county court system in our trial court system. It's important, I think, in this job as Attorney General to both know how to do the job and to get elected. I believe that I've been informed, first of all, by being the oldest of 11 children. I was born in St. Cloud. I've seen the problems day after day after day in real court, not an abstract concept. We're going to win this election. We're going to make Keith Ellison a one-term Attorney General. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Jude, and please join me in thanking all of the candidates as we excuse them now from the stage. Thank you. And let's also thank my co-moderators with me tonight, John Helmberger and Pafua Yang. Now I just want to ask that you stay in your seats. The straw poll results will be announced now.
Impatient, I couldn't wait for her. Thanks to our crack team, we've already got the ballots tallied, and I've got results for you. Do we have a screen? Okay, so I'm just going to have to read these to you. Apparently the slide is not ready. So I am going to announce the results here, starting with third place. Judge Jude with 58 votes out of the total votes cast, which is 22% of the total votes cast. In second place, we have Doug Wardlow with 85 votes cast. That's 32% of the total votes. And in first place is Jim Schultz, 106 votes cast, 40% of the total. In addition to those, we had 2 votes for other, which was 0.7%, and 13 votes undecided, which was 5%. Well, I want to thank you again for joining us tonight for the Minnesota Leadership Forum Attorney General Candidate Debate. It's been a good night, and I'm thrilled that you all were here to be part of it. You here at Providence Academy, as well as the audience on radio, AM 1280 The Patriot, and a live stream online with Alpha News. Thank you once again, and thank you again to our co-sponsors. Good night.